Hello everyone and welcome to the ninth part of the Q&A in the lecture series Through Dhamma, following in the footsteps of the Buddha. With me here is Saif. Welcome Saif, and thank you for participating in this Q&A. I hope that people will benefit a lot from your wisdom, and I think without further ado we will just start. We have probably like 30 more questions today. We will very likely not finish all of them, but we will do our best. And I will just start with the first question, and this one is from Aspat. And he asks the following thing. Hi, I've been in Vipassana 10-day retreats, also tried many meditations, but found none that would stick for long. Maybe because of ADHD I've been diagnosed with. I found this emotional non-reactivity really helpful and easy to practice during the day. The question now is Vipassana a clear Buddha's teaching? You want to begin?
Sure. Vipassana just, of course, in the sutras, it just means insight. So, to that extent, of course, Vipassana is part of the Buddhist teaching, but it very much depends on what Vipassana means to you. And to that extent, there's so many different interpretations. And I don't really know what Vipassana retreat you're on. So it's kind of hard to say, but I mean, if the emotional non-reactivity is easy to practice during the day, it's a good sign, and probably something that you should continue doing. And probably more insight will be able to be developed through that, even if it's just noticing basically where suffering is on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, beyond that, it's kind of hard to say too much about the specific Vipassana you were practicing, because I just don't know.
I guess when people talk about 10-day retreats, it is most of the time about the QnA kind of retreats. I obviously also cannot say, but this is the most popular one around the world. So maybe given that context, you can answer in a different way or have some additional information.
Yeah, I mean, with Goenka, the problem with it is obviously that it doesn't have that practice during the day thing. You kind of do the meditation for 10 days, and you probably can get a lot of certain insights that way, at least, mainly from just the seclusion. Maybe not even through the meditation necessarily, but just through that distance of the mind. But all it does teach you is meditation, and a lot of the times they don't, especially when beginners go into it, they try to keep the instructions very sort of demanding in a way, kind of make you do a very specific thing, because obviously they don't want beginners doing whatever they want. And so it's just like, yeah, just watch the breath, watch the sensations of the body and so on. And it can be releases through that, but it's not really on the same level as the things we've been talking about in terms of practicing the entire gradual training. And it is gradual, it can't really be done on a 10-day retreat. And to that extent, shouldn't necessarily expect anything extremely lasting on the same level as like a soul party from a Vipassana retreat, unless you're already very advanced. Otherwise, it's better to just kind of look at the gradual training and then see where Vipassana as an insight appears in the gradual training, which is basically like after a certain level of wholesome conduct has been achieved.
Yeah, that is also how I see it, to be honest. And I don't have much to add on that. Maybe that most retreats are very temporary in nature. And this is the main problem that exists nowadays when it comes to practicing Dhamma. It is always temporary. You kind of pause your real life, then practice Dhamma, and then you resume your real life. And that is wrong practice. You have to change everything and have to change your behavior and your conduct and make your intentions visible in all areas of your life, and not just 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the evening, or 10 days on a retreat. So when your practice is temporary, then it is oftentimes because many instructions that people give are not very sustainable during a day-to-day context. Whereas, for example, the emotional non-reactivity, or virtue, simple virtue as the Buddha called it, is very sustainable. You can do that at any time, and you should do that at any time. You should always look out for your intentions and stop the bad ones. There's no reason to not do that while working or talking with colleagues or anything like that. So as long as you can do that, not doing the bad stuff, then you are practicing. And you should develop a view that is kind of in line with that. Otherwise, your practice is always incomplete and you will always find yourself not sticking to it because you simply cannot do it. You cannot meditate at all times. And if you think that is a practice, then you will always fall away from it, simply because it is factually unsustainable.
Yeah, you shouldn't, I think we talked about in another video, but you shouldn't expect to like do a certain amount of retreats and then get some insight from it that will do the work for you. It needs to be done, like Klaus was saying, on the level of your entire life, transforming it. You need to be actually doing the work all the time. Yeah. And that's how the true insight of where suffering is rooted can appear, because you're doing the work of where suffering is rooted in your daily life.
Yeah. This is also a good point. Understanding suffering, really understanding suffering, means that you are free from it. This is the first noble truth. So once you have understood suffering and know why you suffer, pretty much, all the four noble truths will be understood at once. So people always get an inkling what suffering is because they feel it all the time, but they don't really know it, because if they really knew it, then they would be free from it. Once you have understood something completely, then you can just move beyond it, and then you are beyond suffering. And yeah, and you can be free from suffering at all times, obviously. This is kind of the goal of meditation, not just in 10-day retreats or on the cushion, but always. Yeah, I hope that is enough. Let us move to the next question. And this one is, where is it? It's also from Aspat. And Aspat wants to know, it's interesting that some stories are kind of similar to the New Testament, like the one about the disciple that tried to kill the Buddha and was swallowed by the earth reminds me of stories about Judah. I've been studying Christianity and found that it borrows stories from other cultures. Buddha was before Christ, right? I think it was for me. Can't really remember. But yeah, there are some kinds of similarities when it comes to religions of different kinds. So it's, especially the virtue part is kind of universal when it comes to many religions. It is just that most religions do not teach us in terms of dependent origination. So in Christianity, there are the 10 commandments that where you could argue that they are a bit like the 5 precepts. But in Buddhism, it's always about the intentions behind your actions, so to speak, and not so much about the actions themselves. And Buddha was before Christ, that is right. I think it was about 600 years before. So there might have been some cross-pollination or something going on. But Saif probably knows a lot more about that. So maybe he can tell you about that.
With regards to Christianity, not as much exploration of Buddhism, but in Greek philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, there's a lot of cross-pollination. But also in general, like I would probably warn against focusing too much on this perennialist aspect where all the religions kind of share these characteristics. Because the Buddha did say that he did not construct the path. It is an ancient path that every sage in the past who has reached Nibbana has followed. And there are kind of things in the various traditions of today that you will find that are quite seemingly very similar. But the more you basically focus on this perennialist aspect, the more you will basically have to sort of shave off those parts that are not quite the same in traditions to try and make it fit together. And the more you do that, the more you basically impoverish each tradition. Especially if you want to like understand dependent origination, that is something that's quite unique to Buddhism, and you're not really going to be able to understand that by trying to compare it too much to other doctrines. So it's probably best to just focus on one specific path. Obviously, not like denigrating other paths necessarily, but you want to, like, for your practical experience, for the practical development, focus on one specific path and just develop that fully. But yeah, apart from that, it's not too useful to think about cross-pollination necessarily.
No. I think there are philosophers that kind of point out the similarities between all the religions. I think Guénon, or how he is spelled, some French guy, some French philosopher, talks a lot about that. I think Ajahn Chah also says that quite often, that many religions at least have the same goal when it comes to the purity of the mind. And I think Kamma also says that quite often. And while I do believe that the goal is kind of the same, I do not think that the instructions and methods are identical. And I do not think that all of them will necessarily lead to the same result, even though the ideal might be shared. So maybe that is also something to look out for. I personally have never had a really much interest in anything despite Buddhism, from beginning to end. The moment I discovered spirituality, I went all out on Buddhism and never stopped. So I cannot really say anything about that. But maybe Saif has something to add concerning, for example, Guénon.
Yeah. Guénon is a good example because his texts are all basically to do with insights from this sort of perennial tradition that each specific tradition takes part of. So he always talks about specific parts of this universal doctrine, but then he always shares insights from each tradition. He does recommend you to then you have to follow one tradition, but it's very easy to read it and just become this person that collects these insights and collects these all these traditions are pointing to one thing. So I'm just gonna sort of syncretize them together and then just follow that universal path. And that's definitely not the thing you want to do. You have to follow, we've said it before, like utterance of another is necessary because you need the path from someone, a specific person. There is the originator of the path, or one of his disciples at the very least. There's also like a lot of the more modern people, like there's D.T. Suzuki, who's like a Zen person. He did a lot of work in relation to Christianity with, I think, Thomas Merton. There's like the Kyoto school, like the Japanese Zen people, and they did a lot of work with Christianity, talking a lot about the relationship between Zen and Christianity. I think other religions as well, but they're always doing it for like purposes of like world religion, like not fighting between them. Which is why I said before, you don't want to like denigrate other religions necessarily. Like you want there to be some sort of, well, you want to have a mind of non-ill will basically. But you also don't want to basically ruin the uniqueness of any path by trying to fit them into other molds basically. It's the same with philosophy as well. You don't want to like reduce, we talked a bit before about like, is Buddhism like virtue ethics, is it deontology and so on? You kind of don't want to fit it into that hole because it kind of ruins everything that's unique about Buddhism. Like if you say it's kind of deontological, but it's nothing like Kant. It's kind of like virtue ethics, but it's nothing like Aristotle. So you always want to kind of focus on its uniqueness basically. I would say that's the end of it.
The details matter.
Yes.
And you should not try to generalize them away. That is maybe a good way of putting it. Yeah. Maybe in summary, try to fix on one path. Don't jump from practice to practice. If you just compare it with, for example, exercise or lifting weights, you don't want to jump from program to program either. You will not get any results like that. If you commit to one program, you will get the results of that one program. It might not have been the best program, but after doing it, you can switch again and find a better one maybe. But it's probably not a good idea to just hop and hop and hop and never start actually putting things into practice.
Yeah, it's even within Buddhism as well. Like you don't want to like do one meditation technique and then try a different one out the next week, and then do some Mahayana practice and then some Vajrayana practice. You want to kind of just follow one single unified thing to its fullest extent.
Yeah, I think the Goenka retreats also say that it might not be too inclusive when they give you instructions that say, please try to follow what we do here and not other things on our retreats, because they cannot really assist you when you do something else. And you will probably not get the results that they try to teach if you do something else. It should be quite obvious, but if you do something, then commit to it. It would be best if you just commit to the Pali Canon and the Suttas, in my opinion, but many people are not immediately ready for that. So
yeah, I remember like when I started practicing, obviously my background's in philosophy, so I always had like several different philosophers in my mind, at once alongside the Dhamma and so on. And I'd always like compare them and practice a bit of this, practice a bit of this, try to compare these insights. But at some point, like the point is, like if you are like practicing to the point of going beyond doubt, then there is no more room for you to be practicing some of this and some of this and some of this. You will just be practicing one thing because you know that that's the thing. That's what needs to be developed to some extent. Obviously, at the beginning, you will have doubt, but you do need to commit to something and not just be like, I'll take a bit of Spinoza, I'll take a bit of the Buddha. Because there are philosophers like that, and there are like even like mystics like that. I remember reading a biography of Ibn Arabi, who was like a Muslim, very famous Muslim saint, and he went to like several different teachers and took some from every single one of them, and kind of syncretized it almost into his own thing. But that's not really the thing that you want to develop, or at the very least, doing that kind of thing is likely to lead you astray and just become a collector of different ideas.
Yeah. I think the Buddha also said that among the 9 things a stream enterer cannot do is not being able to take another teacher other than the Buddha. So you kind of have to gradually move toward that if you want to become a Sotapanna, because part of the definition of a Sotapanna is his inability to follow another teacher. He can still read other philosophies, but he cannot invest toward that, like really start believing that, because for him everything is Dhamma now. Yeah. I think that is enough for that question. Let us maybe move to the next one. And this one is from Helen B. And he wants to know, how does the TMI style of awareness or mindfulness differ from the Pali Canon? And this one would be for you, I think.
It's been a while since I practiced TMI, but I'd probably say there is this idea that of like awareness of the background in TMI, but it's always sort of tethered still to a specific object that you're concentrated on. So you're concentrated on an object and at the same time sort of aware of the background. And that's sort of the main difference with the Yonaso Manasakara awareness that we talked about from the Pali Canon, because like the Buddha gives a simile of like mindfulness of the body. It's like you have these 5 animals that want to go towards their feeding grounds, which are the senses. And mindfulness of the body is like stick a stake in the ground and you tie these animals up. And if you do that, they're unable to go towards the feeding ground, which is the opposite of the TMI way, because TMI, you concentrate on an object and you're aware of the background. But with the Pali Canon, to the extent that you're aware of the background is the extent to which the sense, you cannot go towards the senses, basically. So with the Pali Canon awareness, it's always in that level of withdrawal, of stepping back, and there's no basic limit to how much you step back. And there's at no point basically a tethering towards the senses in any ways, which is why, like, if you fully develop that, it leads to like the formless realms and so on, and what the Buddha talks about, like the signless concentration of mind and so on. So yeah, that's the main difference, I would say.
No. Yeah, I would also say in the Pali Canon there's never really the focus on any specific sense object. It is always about the nature of things. And this is maybe important to keep in mind. I think the TMI book introduces lots of different models of mind moments and consciousnesses and nested subconsciousnesses and everything like that. And he tries to create a nice model for all those things. And those models are kind of nice for understanding, I think, as a beginner, but they are kind of besides the point, because in the end you have to understand everything when it comes to Dhamma in your own experience. And you cannot really use external models for that. It always has to be on the basis of what you are feeling right now. So models will always be secondary to that. And yeah, I would be careful there. So the book kind of shares the same weaknesses as many of the other styles of mindfulness that are popular nowadays. It's not as bad as some others, where people think of mindfulness as really being intensely focused on one object, but it's still not really in line with the Pali Canon. Maybe that is a good way of putting it. And something I also want to point out is something should be 100% right if it will lead you to liberation. So there's nothing like 99% right Dhamma or something like that. People always get kind of upset when I criticize a teacher who is obviously a bit less wrong than another teacher, but he's still wrong in some aspects. And I think that is still blameworthy to a degree, or still worthy of criticizing that aspect where the teacher is wrong. Simply because even a tiny bit of wrong understanding can hinder your progress towards liberation. And people who have a great following because they tell you many right things, but one wrong thing can cause a lot of harm, in my opinion. And I think the Buddha even said that in some sutta, that monks who have great fame, who have great reputation, who have practicing for a long time, who have a great following, when they do something wrong, it is for the harm of many people. If someone, on the other hand, just talks gibberish somewhere, no one will listen to that person anyway, and there's not much harm that he can cause. So yeah, so don't take that criticism as everything is wrong about those teachings. It is, again, from the ultimate point of view of fully making the breakthrough to the Dhamma and escaping samsara. Yeah. Anyway, anything you want to add on that question?
No, we can move on, I think.
Perfect. Then let's move on. Now we have another question from an anonymous person, and the person wants to know, where can I order good translations of the Nikayas? I heard that there are bad and or misleading ones. And yeah, so first of all, if you have no money, the best website you can probably go to is Sutta Central. There are many translations of different people or different monks who offer their translations. I personally like the ones from Thanissaro Bhikkhu. They are quite good, in my opinion, so you can look out for those. You can also look out for Sujato Bhikkhu, I think is his name. You can also look out for those. You will notice that there are some differences among them, so you will have to get used to mapping the words that both different translators use to the Pali words, pretty much. Apart from that, the Metta Forest Monastery from Thanissaro Bhikkhu also offers a service where they send you copies of the Nikayas and many other books for free. So you can send them a physical letter, and I think Saif did that. And maybe you can say something about that. And they actually give you those books. This is especially interesting for new practitioners, probably very young practitioners who don't have lots of money, because on Amazon, as an example, the Nikayas cost like $80 the book, and that can be quite expensive. So yeah, and yeah, I would go for that route if I was living in the United States, for example. And I think they do ship outside of the United States, but there are other restraints, as it's much more expensive because those are heavy books. Yeah. Anything you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, they recommend, like, if you're shipping outside the United States, probably to like get even more than, like, don't get like 2 books, but get like quite a few of them. So it's like worth the shipping costs. But yeah, if you just send them a letter, basically, just asking them what you want, they will try their best to send you it. Obviously, it's good to like donate a bit of money if you can to help them out, because it's a very good service. But yeah, the Bhikkhu Bodhi ones are quite expensive usually, but they're quite a nice like hardcover copy, and they're good to have around. And I think all the translations are a bit misleading to some extent, or at the very least, like, you probably won't be able to understand everything fully from the translations, especially like terms like sankharas, like formations, or whatever the translator has is going to be confusing at first. So really, any translation is fine. You probably have to compare them anyways.
No, that's a good way of putting it. I also have the Nikayas from Bhikkhu Bodhi and Morris Welch, or however he's called, lying around, and I have read them as a hardcover book. They are sufficiently good if you also have a mindset that you really try to understand what is in there. For example, it took me 2.5 Nikayas until I got a glimpse of understanding what a Sankhara even is. And it doesn't really matter how you translate it. If it is a formation, a fabrication, a determination, whatever. Maybe it's even better to just leave the word Sankhara there so that people know what is meant in that situation. Yeah. But apart from that, maybe order from the forest monastery. And it is important that you just have the mindset that those translations might be flawed. It is not so much about the translation itself. Whenever there's something in question, you can just look it up. Maybe look at the Pali. The Sutta Central website also offers that. And I think there is also a digital Pali reader from sirimangalo.org. where you can also find out what the Pali is for a certain sutta. And then you can just see what is in there whenever there's something in question. Yeah, I think we can move to the next one. Okay. And this one is from another anonymous person, and that person wants to know, how do I incorporate lucid dreams into the practice of Dhamma? And this one is for you.
Probably shouldn't, to be honest. It's probably not something that needs to be really developed. I assume if you're practicing, there's probably like things in the waking life that can be focused on instead. Better focused on just practice of non-activity, non-aversion, non-distraction, non-lust, just dwelling in that and trying to figure out dependent origination, mindfulness of body or death or whatever you want to do. But the dream world, I think the Buddha says at some point there's like minimum you can do with dreams or something along those lines. It's basically not in the sutras at all, except for like 1 or 2 or maybe 3. So it's not really something that needs to be focused on.
No, I think the Buddha focuses on wakefulness. He tells you not to sleep too much instead of trying to make your sleeps about the practice or practice while you sleep. If I remember correctly, there was one sutta that is more or less storytelling, how the Buddha had 4 dreams that foretold his awakening. And then there was another sutta where a king was dreaming something and he was trying to act upon that dream. And then maybe some other stray sutta where there were also dreams mentioned. But apart from that, there is nothing, simply because you cannot really practice while you are sleeping. There is an interesting point, so to speak, shortly before falling asleep, where it feels like a release and where it feels very good, and people kind of mistake that for practice or for progress when they are kind of dozing and it feels kind of nice. But in the end, you have to be very awake, very alert for practicing Dhamma. And
yeah, Dhamma is definitely not about the like subconscious. It's very much about the conscious.
yeah, which is also something that is very different from the book, the Mind Illuminated, where he pretty much talks about the subconscious at all times. It very much is about conscious decisions, conscious actions, responsibility, and all those things.
All actions are conscious, basically.
Yeah, the intentional action. Well, yeah. It's a bit different. It's a bit difficult for people to understand when it comes to intentional actions. And intentional intentions is always also something that Tero says. Maybe you can say something about that. When someone says that all actions are intentional, that's quite hard to understand, I believe, for some people.
Yeah, I mean, even like the like actions that you do that seem like, for example, you slide into sensuality, it may seem like the experience just takes over and you have no control, and then just the mind just launches you into sensuality. But there is no basically action of sensuality unless you genuinely accept an intention that has arisen that's going towards sensuality. You have to accept it, otherwise you can't go in that direction. And that's basically what you realize with a certain amount of restraint. So that's basically the crux of it.
Yep. Everything that you could say no to is your responsibility. And you can always say no to sensuality, as an example. So that is always intentional in that regard. You could have said no to all those things. And at any given point in time, you can say no or stop. So, yeah. That is
it might be like more subtle. Maybe you're not like noticing that there's an accepting of sensuality, but the mind cannot make you go towards it. You have to accept it. And you can trick yourself in all sorts of ways into accepting it. But that's the main thing. You do accept it. You do make the choice.
Yeah, that is very important to keep in mind. The point of acceptance, there's always a giving in, so to speak. Maybe that's a good way of thinking about it. And then you say, now I can't do anything about it anymore. At any given point you could, but you tell yourself the story and buy into it, that you cannot do anything. Or now it's too late anyway. Now I can go through with it.
Yeah.
That's
also why you have to do the work, and you can't just accept. You can't just like do a meditation and accept that to do the work for you, because it is all about the actual choices you're making and choices that you don't have to make. It's not like you have to unlock this secret part of your mind and then that just this insight happens and then the calmness appears. No, it's just you have to not make them choices anymore.
You have to stop making the bad choices. That's maybe a good way of putting it. Or that's the main part of the practice. There's some cultivation going on. As for example, Majjhima Nikaya 2, 3 to 10 or something like that, talk a lot about that there is taints that should be overcome by cultivation, as an example. But even that cultivation is a lot about not doing things that go against that. So it's kind of always about that non, and I think we talked about that in a lot of detail before. Yeah. But yeah, I think we can now move to the next question. And this one is from Sandeep. And he wants to know, you mentioned it's best to change the meditation once it gets too easy, comfortable. Do you mean introducing some kind of discomfort or changing techniques altogether? This one is for me, so I will give it a first go. And I think I said that in the context of people who are practicing specific methods. When they are doing specific meditation methods, then they should at least change them once it gets too easy. That was the context of that question. So you kind of benefit from a certain technique to a degree if you have to restrain yourself to do it, if you have to endure doing that technique, if it is hard in some way or another, when it restrains your access towards sensuality, as an example, or something like that. When, for example, simple things like eating slower or restraining your eating. While you are eating your favorite meal, don't wolf it down, eat it slowly. That is a form of restraint. Already, it's not the best kind of restraint, for sure, but it's better than nothing for a beginner. And in that regard, if there's no challenge anymore in that kind of following a method, then you cannot really expect any benefits anymore. It's like with exercise. If you just squat a barbell of like 100 kilograms and do that for all your life, you won't get stronger. There has to be some challenge involved. You have to really say no, for example, to your mind in a more difficult way. And as the second part of the question suggests, yes, you need some discomfort, and that discomfort is usually just introduced by restraint. Saying no to more things that the mind wants in the central domain. And yeah, that can also come from changing techniques altogether, or from even ditching all technique altogether and simply just practicing according to the suttas. And just doing the restraint, the enduring, and all those things. The non-sensuality, pretty much. Yeah. Anything you want to add on that question?
Yes, it's probably better to go towards the restraint rather than changing techniques. Because if you change techniques, you'll end up doing the same thing basically. There'll be a limit to which you'll go. And the only way you're going to go beyond all of that domain is by just introducing that general level of restraint in regards to lust, aversion, and distraction. And yeah, just increasing that by a bit always just increases the amount of discomfort. So that's all you need to do basically.
Yeah, that is also important. That advice that I give in, for example, chapter 9 of the lecture is for very beginners. And I think I try to point that out in a practice timeline that I lay out. That is in the very newbie phase where you just get introduced to the practice. There you can still benefit from such practices. Just watching your breath according to any teacher, really. There is restraint involved in that, so you will get some results, which is what will deceive you into following more of the teacher, because you got some results, even if that practice is very wrong. At least that part is kind of right, as they simply introduce some restraint. And some restraint is obviously better than no restraint at all, and that is already beneficial, but it must be dropped at some point, and you must focus on your intentions. Otherwise, there is no additional progress. You will hit a wall, and that won't be fun. Yeah, I think we have time for one more question, maybe. So let's move to the next one. And this one is also from Sandeep, and he wants to know, what is your opinion on sitting for long periods versus breaking down the practice into smaller chunks, let's say 30 to 40 minutes? From your personal experience, I believe you sit 1 hour in the morning and the night. Is sitting longer than an hour useful? And this question is for you, but we maybe have to point out that that also presupposes that that person thinks that the practice is all about the sitting interval, as we had earlier today. So maybe take the answer with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I mean, sitting, I think, for longer period of times is always going to be better for the most part. It depends a little bit on your lifestyle, but basically the longer you sit is going to be the longer you get deeper into it. And the deeper you get into it, the more difficult it is to go back to grosser forms of action. So if you go for only 30 minutes, you'll get into a certain level of composure, but because it's not super deep, it'll be easier to be pulled out of it. So like, let's say you finish a meditation, you go back to your chores or whatever, because the concentration wasn't that deep, it'll be easier to go back to sensual thoughts or whatever. But if you sat for an hour or longer, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, you will get established in that state, and it will become more and more difficult to return to grosser forms of action, because like what you experience is just so much better. But you also want to develop, I think, the idea that like sitting for longer and longer is just pleasant in and of itself. It shouldn't be like longer than 30 minutes is like difficult. And if it is, it's either it's a sign that you're like not practicing correctly, or or you're just like, mind's not strong enough yet. But like if you're able to sit and dwell with an awareness devoid of sensuality and ill will and so on, it should just be calm, and that's just easy to abide in there. And you will want to abide in there for longer, basically.
Mm. Yeah, but it's also important to keep in mind that the practice is not about sitting. Sitting is just a convenient way. You have to be in some bodily posture at all times, and sitting is just good for that. So you can do that for most of your day. But I think Ajahn Chah also said at some point, if the practice was just about sitting, all the chickens in the world would be enlightened. But they are not. Animals cannot be enlightened. But so it is about what you do while you are sitting. So, and it's also important to not follow some meditation techniques that gives you pleasure while sitting. That is also something that most people do. It's much more about the restraint, the non-activity that will feel quite pleasant after a while once you understood the neutral feeling and all those things. But until then, it can be quite challenging, and then longer sits are beneficial. But yeah, maybe we can move to the next question. Okay, the next question is from Sandeep again, and he wants to know, would you say using the feeling of metta instead of the breath can lead to similar insights and awakening, or would you say that it is more in the category of relaxation or calming yourself? And this one is for you.
Yeah, I would say that it very much depends on what you mean by metta. If it's the practice, it's usually taught, which is sort of developing this feeling of loving kindness and then radiating it outwards towards different sets of people. That'll probably be more the level of relaxation and calming yourself. But if it's at the level of the thing we talked about earlier about developing that framework of non-aversion towards the world, and it's at the level of that non-doing, that withdrawal, that stepping back, and know about doing these things to create these feelings. Yeah, all the time that non-aversion can be quite painful as well. It might not be calming immediately, but in the long run, that will is very much a basis for awakening, for sure. Because it's the same principle as like non-lust towards the jhanas. It's just basically stepping back from the root of craving, and that's sustained over a long period of time, but just basically withdraw you enough to be able to see the rising and passing away of things, because you're not interfering with them any longer through any craving. And that's basically the basis for seeing and having any insight, basically.
Yeah, when you think about metta, it's always good to think about it in terms of non-ill will. The negative phrasing is much more useful than the positive one, because people always try to make a thing out of metta, while it is a non-thing. It's non-ill will, non-aversion. All the Brahmaviharas are that. And yeah, if you pair that with insight, then you get a complete practice pretty much. Because you cannot really have aversion towards other people when you understood, very much understood, not talk to yourself or talk yourself into, that they are also just automatically reacting to their own cravings, then it kind of becomes impossible to harbor ill will for them, because you just see that it's a bit like robots, pretty much. It's just an impulse, automatic response. And how could you be mad at, for example, the weather? That would be madness. You cannot really sustain that, given the understanding that you know that it is just like that. And when you have understood that, then metta comes quite naturally. Yeah, I think that answers that question. Maybe move to the next one. And this one is from George, and I paraphrased it. It's a rather long question. And he wants to know, when you speak of samadhi and jhana, you emphasize virtue more, either downplaying or exalting its role, and vice versa. Talking about virtue, you make an accent on insight, saying that morality is basically for newbies, and seeing the real nature of things for the real dudes. There seems to be some unclarity concerning the different cutoff points. Yeah, it's a rather long question, and I will start answering that by giving you a citation from Ajahn Chah that I recently heard, which should kind of make clear what we are talking about here. For example, Ajahn Chah talks about a knife. He says there is a knife, it has a blade, it has a handle, and it has a hilt. And when you pick up the knife, you pick up all three parts at once. And it is the same with the Noble Eightfold Path. It has virtue, it has samadhi, it has panya, it has insight. And you cannot get one of those without the others. So it's kind of difficult to make a cutoff point. You can say that, for example, perfected virtue is what samadhi is. And very established samadhi with some instruction of another is what leads to insight. So you cannot really separate those things. It's more accumulating and stages of maturity of the same thing. I think Ajahn Chah also compared it with a mango that is growing. In the beginning, you have some virtue. That's a young mango, then it's growing more and more, and it becomes a bigger mango. But it's still the same thing. So the practice did not change much. It is just that it looks different now. So you cannot really find clear cutoff points between those phases. It's more like an accumulator. The longer you do it, the more it transforms itself, while you still do the very same thing than before. I just emphasize virtue a lot because that is what most people are missing. And what they think of as samadhi is something very different. That is why I say that you should look out for your wrong views at that point too, because it is not very much in line what the Buddha taught as samadhi. So that is the main thing. That is why I emphasize to point to certain types of wrong views. And that is how that emphasizement comes to be. But yeah, anything you want to add on that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's good to think of. There might be confusion about like the nature of virtue that we talked about, because I think virtue, obviously, in its like grossest sense, which means is the five precepts, basically what you do in relation with others. But it is, you sometimes talk about as emotional non-reactivity. So it's basically the entire spectrum of conduct of body, speech, and mind as well. Which the combination of is obviously jhana, because if you're fully like withdrawn from that domain of craving, not only on physically but also mentally, there's just no more room for any like, oh, I'll go here, or I'll go here, or I'll go here, or I'll distract myself, or I'll do anything. It's just you're abiding in calmness. And that's also why we sort of exalt the role of virtue, because like if you develop virtue, there shouldn't really be that much of any room for you to be like, oh, what should I do next? Because development of virtue means you have restrained yourself from acting out of that exact impulse. Obviously, you can then develop wisdom, but it's on the basis of that withdrawal from the five hindrances, which includes doubt. So usually just virtue, the extent of virtue is not really understood, because if you fully understood the nature of virtue, you would see its extremely immediate connection with samadhi and with wisdom. And then you would see that that's basically the bulk of the practice for the vast majority of people.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be seen as something that's like, oh, I have to do the virtue first. You have to see that like doing the virtue is what's making me calm. It's not like I do virtue and then I get calm later on. It's like I'm doing virtue and that is the calmness.
Oh. I think people have the view that the path as the Buddha laid out is linear, in the sense that you first do the virtue, then you leave the virtue behind, and now you do the samadhi, and that is all you do. And then in the end, all you do is the insight. That is not how it works. You never stop doing the virtue, literally never. If you think about the entire practice as a house of cards, the virtue is the entire foundation. If you stop doing it or remove the foundation, then it just collapses. And then the samadhi is kind of built upon the virtue. It is a more refined version of it. You are now really composed and cannot be moved anymore. In the beginning, you maybe have to forcefully pull the mind back. And now in a state of samadhi, you don't have to do that anymore because your mind started listening to you. And then based on that, you can have wisdom arise as an example. Maybe it's not the best simile, but it should illustrate the point. You cannot stop the virtue. It's impossible. And it's not just precepts. It is about the entire aggregate, all the actions rooted in free diversion and delusion in body, speech, and mind. And that is what most people tend to ignore. But yeah, I hope this makes it very clear why we emphasize as we emphasize. It's good to talk about that in some detail. But yeah, let us maybe move to the next question. And this one is from another anonymous person, and that person wants to know. This book says that the Buddha also teaches that when we come to deeply know the Four Noble Truths and three marks of existence, an understanding of Kamma follows. Is that right? And I think that question is for me. I am not sure if I understand it fully, but when you have understood the Four Noble Truths and can clearly see the three marks of existence, then you also kinda understand Kamma to a degree as action, as the interconnectedness between those different phenomena. But if you, however, talk about the understanding of Kamma as one of the three true knowledges, I forget how they are called in the Pali Canon, then that is not something that automatically emerges. So the knowledge of how beings pass away and reappear according to the Kamma is not something that comes for free. I know at least one person who can do that, as an example, who can see another person and sees their past and how they're moving, as an example. But as I understand it, not everyone develops that. So yeah, it does not come for free. You have to have a mind that is inclined that way and wants to have that. I guess that is a good way of putting it. Maybe you want something to add or have something to add on that question?
Yeah, the main understanding of karma you get from it, it's not necessarily that, as you were saying, but you do understand the nature of wholesome karma, what makes it wholesome, the nature of unwholesome karma, what makes it unwholesome, and also that type of karma, that type of development that leads to the cessation of karma, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. But yeah, the higher knowledge of like seeing the reappearance of beings and so on, it's not necessarily developed unless you put your mind towards it.
No. And it's good to reflect on what Kamma even means in the context of the Buddha's teaching. It just means action. Kamma means action or choice. And you understand action and choice once you understand the Dhamma. And understanding the Four Noble Truths is kind of understanding the Dhamma. And then you have understood the important part of Kamma. Namely, how to overcome it. Once you understand something, you have the ability to transcend it. That is kind of the point of the entire teaching. Laying down the burden of Kamma, the burden of choice, the burden of action. Yeah. Anything else, or should we move on?
Let's move on.
Okay. Then we have another question from Tadas Janusonis, and he wants to know, I thought that the Buddha is just a term for an awakened person. Why were there only 5 Buddhas, and how are they different just from an unenlightened person? Oh, maybe there are some typos in there. This question is for you. So why is it that some traditions have assigned a different meaning to the word Buddha, and what does it mean in the context of the Pali Canon, and why are there only 5 Buddhas in our eon? Maybe that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, Buddha just means awakened person if you're just looking at the text. For example, there are like Pacceka Buddhas, who are the Buddhas who get individually enlightened without the need of a teacher, and they're called Buddhas to that extent, but they're Pacceka Buddhas and not the rightly awakened Buddhas, which are the first person to basically get enlightened in an age and then teach the Dharma to others. That's what makes it a Buddha. So if we basically get enlightened off the Buddhist teaching, we will not become Buddha, we will just become an Arahant. And so, yeah, in our Aeon, there's been 5 ages of Dhamma, basically. As for the traditions, there's kind of hard to talk about because there's just so much different ways of talking about it. Like there's like the Dhamma body of the Buddha, there's the physical body of the Buddha, and so on, and all these different types of things, which can get complicated. There's also like the Bodhisattva stuff. But yeah, at least in the Pali Canon, there is no way of like becoming a Buddha basically through your practice, especially if you're in our age when you have our Buddhist teaching, you're just training for arahantship, and that's it basically.
Yeah, I think the Buddha even said that it is absolutely impossible for another Buddha to arise in a time where there is still the good Dhamma as taught by another Buddha. And it has to be, because by the very definition, the Buddha is the self-awakened one, a person who found the way to liberation, the ancient path to the Dhamma, by himself. And now when the Dhamma is already there, everywhere, literally, you cannot do that anymore. And it's maybe important to mention that the term only 5 Buddhas in this eon is not quite fitting. The Buddha called this eon a fortunate eon, a truly fortunate eon. In most eons, there's not even one Buddha around. So for this eon to have 5, or maybe even a 6th Buddha, if you go by the Maitreya prophecy, maybe prophecy is not the right word, but this is a truly fortunate eon where there's lots of access to Dhamma. But yeah, the main difference is just that some newer traditions of Buddhism mix up or reassign the meaning Arahant to the word Buddha. The Buddha is the self-awakened one, and an Arahant is a person who is awakened by hearing the teachings of the Buddha and then putting them into practice. This is a core difference. Yeah, I think that is enough for that question. Let us maybe move on to the next one. And this one is from an anonymous person. And that person wants to know, why does the mind become dispassionate at seeing that it is not in control? You would think that it wouldn't change the hope for agreeable or aversion to disagreeable. Is it my question or is it yours?
I think it's your question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, these remarks kind of come as a package. You either see them all at once or not at all. And when you see non-control, you always also see dukkha. You always also see structural suffering in that, because you cannot control things. And when you truly see that you cannot control things, then you also see that you cannot control your reaction towards all those things. So you kind of become dispassionate as a result. You have to become dispassionate when you notice that you are not even in control of your own delight, pretty much. So there cannot be any other result when you see the unknowability of things. So yeah, I'm not sure what else to say to that. Maybe you have another take on it?
Yeah, I think you gave the simile before of like, it's like you're playing PlayStation 2 with your older brother or something, and you're having fun or whatever, and then you realize at some point that the controller was not plugged in all the time. You can't really go back to like pretending that, oh yeah, I'm still controlling it. No, you'll see that like none of that was based on anything actual. It's all illusory, and you can't go back to seeing it. You'll just, all of that gratification you were getting from it will be gone, and you will not see it as something enjoyable anymore. And it's the exact same. Once you see that you're not in control, like there is no, you can't just be like, oh, I'll just pretend that I have control. Oh, your mind will just naturally become dispassionate and not proliferate that sense of dependency, because you see it as burning, basically. I guess you could say in the second part of the question, like the mind does not really like, it still sort of prefers agreeable over disagreeable, but it has no more, it does not seek for it. It does not seek for it agreeable. It does not long for it. If agreeable comes its way, it does not get intoxicated with it. It does not try and grasp at it. It doesn't, if it goes away, it doesn't become distraught at that. So that's the kind of thing that you're thinking about. Obviously, if you see like a nice view or something, like the mind will still be like, oh, that's a nice view, but it's not going to be distraught at the view going away or anything, and it's not going to be like seeking nice views all the time. So yeah.
No. Yeah, I think that summarizes that question quite well. Let us maybe move to the next one. And this one is inferred from many people, and it is as follows. What is mindfulness, and how do I do it correctly? And this one is for you.
I guess this would be quite similar to the Yoniso Manasikara question.
Yeah.
I guess there's two stages of mindfulness. There's the mindfulness as part of the path, which is normally like the mindfulness on the four foundations, which is the full Yoniso Manasikara. But there's also like mindfulness at the beginning of the path, which is just basically you becoming more and more aware of your intentions, basically, and not just sliding back into that mode of just being indolent and just going with whichever impulse you're going at. So yeah, the extent to which at the beginning you're aware of your intentions during your full day is the extent to which you are mindful to that extent. And that's basically development of mindfulness at the beginning. And then later on, you can develop further mindfulness of the four foundations by basically seeing mindfulness as a type of knowledge. It's basically just whatever you're doing, remembering that at the foundation of that is some aspect of experience, whether it's body, feeling, thoughts, or mind states, basically, as the background of that. So whether you think, whether you do an action, whether you ponder, whether you have a certain feeling, wherever it is, you simultaneously know that the body, for example, is the basis of it, and you can't own the body, and therefore you can't own the whatever is happening in the foreground. So yeah, it's a bit abstract, but we've talked a lot about Yoniso Manasikara already. Yeah.
I think in that context, it is maybe good to mention that the second type of mindfulness that you describe is very much exclusive for the noble ones. So you can only really do that when you have the right view, when you have already developed the Yoniso Manasikara, the womb attention, sufficiently. Otherwise, you cannot really do that, which is why many people often try to practice what is in certain suttas, but they are not, in a sense, ready for that. If you try to practice, put one of the four foundations of mindfulness into practice and do not even know what that is, then you can only earn frustration through that. So it's good to develop the Yoniso Manasikara first through the visualizing, so to speak, of your intentions first. And then based on that, it will be much more clear that mindfulness can also be understood as remembering the present, remembering what is presently happening. And that is also a very good way to think of mindfulness. But yeah, those two definitions are very different sometimes from how mindfulness is often taught. Yeah. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, the reason why you want to do mindfulness with body and so on, later on, is because unless you develop that first type of mindfulness already, it's probable that you're doing mindfulness of the body, for example, out of aversion or out of lust or whatever. But if you've developed that first type of mindfulness already, you will be aware of the signs of the mind. You will be aware of exactly when you are acting out of craving. And then it becomes basically near impossible, basically, to develop further mindfulness and do it out of craving, because you realize the escape of it to the extent necessary.
Yeah, very good. I think that is sufficient for mindfulness. And what you will notice throughout the entire QnA, that there is a lot of repetition, because there are a lot of angles, a lot of different angles you can attack those questions from. And it depends much more on the views that a person has that asks those questions than on the Dhamma. The Dhamma is always the same. We can just phrase it differently for other types of prior knowledges, so to speak. But yeah, let us move to the next question. And this one is from Aspats again, and he wants to know, do you believe in rebirth? As an ex-Christian, I find it hard to pass my hard-learned critical thinking. And I think that question is for me. do I believe in rebirth? Yes, I do, but I cannot see my past lives, as that is something that you are asking. And in the beginning, and I think we also said that quite often, you do not really have to just believe in rebirth. That is not the type of faith that is requested in Buddhism. You just should have an agnostic attitude towards it, neither denying nor approving of it until you can test, until you can see it for yourself, or until you have developed the right view. Then you don't care anymore. Then you just can accept what the Buddha said and go by faith. So it's not so much about critical thinking. You can still critically think, but the result of critical thinking should be and must be in that situation that you simply cannot answer that question. Here you have a person who has told you 999 truths, namely the Buddha, and now he says something that you cannot check yet. What would be the right thing to say or the right thing to do? In my opinion, the right thing to do would be, yeah, well, he has told me a lot of truth. He has changed my entire life. Maybe I just put the question on the side and maybe answer it later or ponder about it later if it is still relevant, and not so much make it a conditional about continuing to practice or something like that. No. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, you should. You definitely won't get like any hard confirmation through just thinking about it. So you shouldn't expect that. It's better to just either go by faith at the beginning or just be agnostic until you either like understand dependent origination enough so that you understand at least the principle of rebirth, why it applies, or you develop the like actual vision of it.
No. There's a much better way to go about it. You cannot really prove rebirth by scientific methods or anything like that. Dhamma is all about subjective experience. You cannot objectively prove something about subjective experience. That is impossible. The domain of science simply does not apply, or all the science that we have does not apply to the phenomenological parts of our experience. You cannot do that. But yeah, maybe let us move to the next question. And this one is from Trace Reaper, and he asks the following. Before stream entry, where you can be without a teacher, since you know what you need to do to wake up, should you maybe find a teacher or carry on without a teacher and teach yourself with the information you find? And that question is for you.
Well, you can find a teacher, but you shouldn't be like submitting yourself to them completely, in a sense. You should always keep yourself independence, because the only reason you want a teacher is for them to give you the necessary tools or insight to be independent of any teacher, because you've understood the teaching for yourself and gone beyond doubt. And the extent you need to be finding teachers, learning what they say, but like if it's not good enough, you have to kind of have the independence to sort of move on and try something else. Obviously, you need to have practiced it sufficiently. Don't just like practice it shallow in a shallow manner. But yeah, you need to have that independence to be like, oh, I know in my experience what the threshold is. I need to be without suffering. So that teacher is not teaching that to me in the same way that the Buddha had teachers before you were enlightened. You'd be like, I've practiced it and it's still not satisfying enough. I'll find something else. And that's basically the exact same thing that you want to do until you can be without a teacher.
Yeah, that's a very good way to think about it. All the guru stuff that is very prevalent in India, as an example, is not a very good thing in my opinion. It's not very beneficial to just submit yourself to a guru or to a teacher or something like that, because in the end, no one can give you enlightenment or something. You always have to do it for yourself. You can read that up in the Dhammapada as an example, where the Buddha clearly says that no one can liberate another. You have to do it for yourself. You are liberated by yourself, through your actions, and not through another person. Well, yeah, maybe we have time for one or two more questions, so let's move on. Here we have another question from an anonymous person, and that person wants to know, what can I look out for in books that is a red flag when it comes to Dhamma and non-Dhamma? And I think this question is for Saif.
I mean, so a lot of the things we've talked about already, basically, any downplaying of certain parts of the teaching, basically. So you can look at any sutra about the gradual training, and if a book downplays any of its role, like in virtue or in seclusion or in celibacy or whatever it is, that's usually a red flag, because all of those things are in the gradual training are fully necessary for the practice. And also, like the things we talked about before as well, about renunciation rather than meditation and so on. Like, they're not talking about abandoning sensual pleasures, they're just talking about, doing some meditation, then it's probably not exactly in the right direction, because you do need to be abandoning sensual pleasures and seeing the danger in sensuality. So yeah, that's the main thing I would say.
Yeah. Compare with the suttas. And if you find suttas that go against that book, as an example, or that are simply not addressed in that book, then that is usually a bad sign. And there are a lot of those signs that you can look out for. Apart from that, there's not really much that we can say here. It's about that. Yeah. Maybe one more question, and then I think it's enough for today. Okay, the last one for today is, when is a good time to become a monk? And this question is for me, so I can answer it afterwards. Yeah, that's not so easy to tell. First of all, you should probably not become a monk on impulse, simply because you are inspired by a teaching or something like that. Being a monk is a very hard and very difficult lifestyle. It's not something that you can just do without some establishment in the Dhamma. So normally people would become monks in the suttas once they have understood the Dhamma, once they have attained the right view. Whenever you read the excellent Master Gotama statement, that is a person who has just attained the right view and is on the way to becoming a noble one. So that person can become a monk and can continue their training in seclusion, as an example, as they have now the good foundation for practice. But without having even understood the Dhamma, having even understood what the practice even is, it is very likely that you just get frustrated, and that's not a good thing. So I would say, once you can keep the 8 precepts, as an example, without experiencing them as a type of restraint or something being taken away from you, then maybe it is a good time that you can actually reconsider becoming a monk. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, it's basically same as what we said before about the time where you basically can see the signs of your own mind, when you can see the difference between craving and non-craving, sensuality and non-sensuality, because then you can tell what your motivation is for becoming a monk. Because if it is out of aversion towards responsibility or anything else, really, like anything that's coming out of craving, the gratification from it can only be temporary. So the gratification of becoming a monk will be temporary, and to that extent, there is quite a big chance that you might disrobe or so on. But if you have understood the signs of your mind, you will be in a much better place to assess what you need to do further. Maybe becoming a monk is part of that, and you will know that you're not doing it out of craving, because you know what your mind state is.
Yeah.
But also, we're not monks, so you should probably take advice with a degree of salt.
Yeah. That's the thing. What Saif just said is just another way of expressing a person having the right view, by the way, in case that was not clear from the context. So that person is already a Sotapanna. So what we say here essentially is, if you are already a Sotapanna, then you at least have the chance to be a monk for good reasons and actually finish the job. If you are not yet a Sotapanna, it's much harder. If you, for example, look at the talks that Ajahn Chah gave, then you will suddenly be very disenchanted, because 90% of all monks disrobe after like 3 months. And after a few years, even 90% of what remains also disrobe and never become a monk again. And even in the West, where people become monks, it's more of a vacation or some career choice, if they are psychologists or something like that. You see people who just become monks for a while for their CV or something ridiculous even. And that's not a very good thing. So the threshold should kind of be the right view. Then you can safely become a monk for the right reasons, and then you can actually finish the job. But again, Saif is completely right. Take our opinion with a grain of salt. We are not monks.
I mean, it's either you become a Sotapanna or you like just have a very apparent like extreme desire for Dhamma. Like when you read like Nanavero, for example, you can tell that he was a person like even before he became a Sotapanna. That was basically his full life goal, and there was nothing that could deter him from that. And if that is you, then that's a possibility. But you would have to see for yourself. Basically, it's hard to say coming externally.
No, we cannot decide that for you. That is always kind of the gist of it. You must know your own motivations. That is very important. But yeah, I think that answers that question sufficiently. And I think it's a good time to stop for now. So again, thank you very much for listening to this Q&A. Thank you very much for being here. If you enjoy what we do, feel free to let us know in the comments. If there are any additional questions, feel also free to let us know in the comments. It's always good to have follow-up questions, and it's good to let others profit from what we say here. So in that sense, thank you very much for being here, and have a pleasant remaining day. Goodbye.